So first of all, I want to thank all of you. I'm going to be closing out in about, so I'm going to get you out of here in about 10 or 15 minutes at the most. So I have a number of thanks to extend, and I'll do that in a moment. But first, let me just sort of tie up a couple of loose ends. One, some people noticed, they said, the Kerner Commission had a chapter on the media. Where's the media? Point well taken. Obviously, how we talk about things, the organs we use to talk about things, narrative, stories we live in, is really important. So, and I think it was weaved through a number of the comments, although with 50 speakers, I guess we didn't feel like we had space for another panel. But the point is well taken, that communication, narrative, stories as well is important in terms of this work. I want to pick up a couple of high themes and then come back to practically what we can do and then close out. So one of the high themes, there's some themes that sort of come up in these spaces a lot. Sometimes they're explicit, sometimes they're implicit. You sort of heard some of it toward the end of today's conversation about essentially, would it be easier if we moved beyond identity politics and talked about economics? And the short answer is no. The reason is what's called identity politics is usually the concern and grievances of marginalized communities. And what we're told in some ways is that if gays would stop talking about sex, if women would stop talking about Me Too, if blacks would stop talking about incarceration, if Latinos would stop talking about immigration, and if Native Americans would stop talking about sovereignty, we could have a united front. So whose issues are left on the table when you take all those issues off? So actually what oftentimes masquerades as non-identity politics is identity politics in a white robe. All politics are identity politics. We care about who we are. Now it is true, I can talk about myself in such a way that excludes everyone else. I call that breaking. Or I can talk about myself and at the same time be open to other people talking about themselves. I call that bridging. So the issue is not should we talk about ourselves or not, it's how we do it. And some of you remember as students of history, in the 1930s and 40s, when Roosevelt was in the White House, and then eventually the United States was going to war, it was like, okay, we have really big issues. We have a war. So black community, let's not talk about lynching. Now, when you dig deeper into that, why didn't Roosevelt want to talk about lynching? What he was saying, and of course he and Eleanor split over this issue, he was saying, if we talk about lynching, the good white people that I need to win the war are going to be mad. So the good white people, meaning the Southern Democrats, we have to accommodate them, and you have to just be lynched for a little longer until we win this war. That same argument is being made today. Basically saying to black people, okay, maybe, all right, maybe some of y'all getting shot by the police in the streets, but can we not talk about that so that I can try to get the Trump supporters to do something else? And it's actually misunderstanding race at a fundamental level. Race is not just about people's attitudes, it's about structure. So we saw in terms of some of the stuff around schools, it's not simply saying there's a black person, there are 9 black kids that want to go to school, which your school, which the Supreme Court says is required. It's Cheryl, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Brown 1 and 2 was the first case of that nature where the court said segregation was wrong. It was constitutionally in violation, a unanimous court, but it said, we're going to come back in Brown 2 and say, but we know this stuff is hard. We know that some of y'all invested in this arrangement. So Brown 2's famous adage was that you have to do this, but with all deliberate speed. Now, this is legal talk, for means you don't have to do this at all. And nothing happened for 10 years because the court was basically saying to the white community, you're violating the Constitution, but we understand that there's a lot going on and you invested in it and it's about your kids, so y'all don't have to do anything. And so there was almost no movement in terms of integrating the schools for 10 years. Again, because the court was saying we have to accommodate white races. And so black people, y'all still going to inferior schools, but only for 10 more years. And then we'll look at it. I also want to just a couple other comments. One is that segregation is never just about separating people. When we talk about segregation, we're talking about segregation of opportunity, segregation of resources. So when people say, yes, but what if all the resources were equal, there'd be no reason to separate people. The whole purpose is to make resources unequal. So if we really had equal, we wouldn't have segregation. And we act like they're two different things. Give black people and Latinos as much money, as much resources, as much respect as white people. What do you think blackness is? What do you think whiteness is? Whiteness is claiming, in the United States, whiteness is about claiming more resources. It's about saying, I'm better than. It's about white dominance. You take that away, as Heather McGhee says, if you're used to being superior, equality seems like an attack. So a few years ago, 15% of white Americans self-identified as white identity being important and believed in some kind of white dominance. That number is now 30%. So what do you say to someone who says, I believe I have a right to dominate you? And that conversation is all over the United States now. I mean, sometimes it's like we have a right to dominate black people, Latinos, women. We have a right to dominate the Chinese. How dare the Chinese think they should own the land around China for themselves? Literally, in the New York Times today, there's an article basically saying, if China challenges the US dominance, that could lead to World War III. And so what do they place the blame? On the Chinese. How dare they challenge the legitimate US dominance? And what China says is, when does that dominance end? We talk about equality, but we have to insist, we want equality where we're dominant. That's good equality, that's the kind we want. So what we're in the middle of is something quite amazing. Depressing, but also amazing. And it's not going to stop with Trump. It didn't start with Trump. We're in the middle of the world changing with all these drivers, technological change. Thomas Friedman said we're in an age of acceleration, globalization, technology, but also millions and millions of people, largely from the South, moving north, driving some people crazy. The demographic change that we talk about, and there's very strong empirical data on this. So when we talk about the changing diversity in the country, many people in the United States, and not just white people, but certainly conservative white people, at an unconscious level, if not a conscious level, they are freaking out. We say 2050, and they say, can we stop the clock? Can we make America white again? I mean, can we build a wall? What can we do to stop America from being anything but white? So they're freaking out. And, you know, I mean, and we've known this for a long time. So part of the things we talked about in terms of problems, in terms of Kerner Commission, the thing that it didn't really nail hard enough, I think, is that the issue that's really driving this country to disunite, to destroy our democracy and eventually destroy our economy, it's not the locking up of blacks. It's not immigrants taking our job. It's whiteness. We have to have a space of talking about the role of whiteness in the formation of this country, not white people, not people who are phenotypically white, although sometimes they go together, not all the time. But it's the idea of whiteness, because whiteness is about dominance. And at the point that more and more people are rejecting that dominance, it becomes more and more frantic. And so what Trump represents is a promise of restoring white dominance. And I think we have to be careful not to just invert this. And that's why one of the reasons the Black Panther movie was so cool, which I'm going to see for the third time maybe this weekend, because it's not inverting the dominance. And I think those of us involved in the movement, we have to be careful not to just say, if they want this, we have to want the opposite of this. So we have to create a space where literally we can learn to live together. We can learn to build bridges. And we're doing that. Just as a footnote, and now turn to solutions and close. In California, I think in 2020, half of the families formed in California will be what's called interfamilies, which means somebody in the family either married or partnered with someone of a different race or ethnicity, or there's someone in the family of a different race or ethnicity. Half the people in California, 40 million people. In 2020, probably 44, 45 million people. So we're actually making new identities right now, and it's driving some people crazy. Think about the idea of one drop. One drop of black blood, whatever that is, one drop of black blood will destroy whiteness. That's some powerful blood. But then when I looked at it a little more carefully, I realized that blood ain't so powerful. What's really the problem is that whiteness is so fragile. So it's the fragility of whiteness. And so literally in Poland, when they're talking about white purity, anything that claims purity is necessarily fragile. Necessarily fragile. And it's also a lie. There's nothing that's pure. That's part of its fragility, that it's a lie. So we have to create a new narrative, but a narrative that really is inclusive, even while we center our work around people who are hurting the most. So what can we do? You've heard a lot of stuff in terms of these are the problems, and you've heard some solutions in this last panel. But let me just start with two things. Very simple. We vote, we win. Let me just repeat that. We vote, we win. Now, I know the voting system is whack. And I know this thing called gerrymandering. But why do you think, after the Supreme Court made its ruling, 23 states rushed to change the voting laws to make it hard for a lot of us to vote? They know that if we vote, they lose. Look at the prison system. If we didn't have mass incarceration, or if people in prison could come out and vote immediately, since Roosevelt, we would have had one Republican president. And that's just black people getting out, blacks and Latinos getting out of prison and voting in the same way that the black and Latino community votes. So in Florida, 1.2 million people out of prison, most of them black and Latino, can't vote. 1.2, the Republicans have never won an election in Florida by 1.2 million people. So it's like, no, we can't have those people voting. You saw what happened in North Carolina when the governor said, I'm going to remute this. They said, no, you can't do it. They went all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And what the court ruled is that he can do it, but he has to do one, that is letting ex-offenders or people returning home, he has to do it one person at a time. And there are thousands. And so if you go to North Carolina, you'll see the governor walking around with a sling on his arm from signing all those bills. But so get involved, vote. And part of the thing in terms of getting involved is not to be seduced by the politics of despair and the politics of distrust. And it's easy for us, even in this audience, to think, well, we can't trust each other, and we certainly can't trust the government. And so we need an alternative thing. We're not going to trust the government. And I'm not saying you should trust the government, but you can't turn your back on it. You have to figure out how to make the government accountable. There is no alternative solution to the government. Maybe they'll invent one, but we don't have one yet. We have to engage these institutions and make these institutions responsive. And it's not going to be a straight line. And we do it at every level: federal, state, local, school board, every level. Make the government responsible for the larger good. And There's a big election coming up in 2018. So when we talk about strategies, I don't give up on the federal government, not because I believe in it, but because it is our government. And when people get upset and talk about going to Canada, I say, go to Canada, but come back. This is our country, not Trump's country. This is our country. Claim it. So I'm going to end. I just want to acknowledge Jack Bogert came up with some great ideas about saying if places like Berkeley saying we're going to give you a benefit, a plus, if you go to an integrated school. And I would say we have to, Robert Sampson helps us. In his book, he says with 4 to 6 indicators together, those 4 to 6 indicators, 93% of the people living at those indicators are African Americans. So the court says you can't use race, but we can still use indicators, right? In fact, Kennedy says we can use indicators. So if you say, if you go to a single race school that's middle class, you don't get a plus at Berkeley. Now, why would I add middle class? Well, I can tell you, single race schools that are all black are not middle class. I'm just saying that. I mean, that's just, so you can get around the race issue. But Lonnie Grenier, some of you may know Lonnie's work. She's written a book where she actually develops that idea that Jack mentioned. It's called Tyranny of Meritocracy. And she talks about how we use meritocracy. Instead of using, if we say we value diversity, then we should reward people for embracing diversity. Whether it's Google citing where it's going to build this new facility, or whether it's Berkeley deciding how students are going to get in. So we have a lot of work to do, but we can do it. And I don't despair, generally ever. Although, last election was, that was some stuff. But I really feel like we're up to the task if we collectively do the task. And the only time that I really wonder is when I see us gathering around what I call a circular firing squad, where we actually are pointing all of our guns at each other. But if we can learn, yes, we won't all agree on everything, but we can agree on enough. So with that, let me end by just thanking the people who have made this possible. I want to sort of give a special thanks to Johns Hopkins and to Ben Siegel and James McComb. I also want to acknowledge the Policy Institute and to Thea Lee for her leadership. Special thanks to the Ford Foundation for giving us money, and the Spencer Foundation, who's now run by someone who's part of Haas, Niela. I don't think she's in the audience. A special thanks to Stephen Menendian and Richard Rothstein, who co-chaired and co-edited this thing. Thanks to Gerald Lenoir. And of course, thanks to the people who did the audio-visual. And all this stuff is going to be streamed, so you can look at it on later when you are more comfortable and warm. Again, special thanks to Gerald Lenoir. And then the folks who are serving us food and cleaning up after us, I want to give a special thanks to them, to the student volunteers. And also, special thanks to all of you. And there's a march or demonstration about immigration, I think, right outside of here when this is over, so you can join that if you like. And I believe that we can actually make a space and a world where people can thrive. We're doing a lot of interesting things in California right now. Not perfect, but the California government is in a real partnership. I know all of you are not from California, but you can do stuff right now. And if we're really successful, not only will we make the earth a safe place for humans and other living creatures, but we will make America, California, make America Mexico again. So thank you.